There are a total of 7 different categories of simple machines that students are allowed to use for the Mason machine competition. Those categories include inclined plane, lever, wedge, wheel and axle, pulley, screw, and electronics. Please be aware that if any of the machines that the student decides to use falls in a category that is not included on this list, then that action will not count for the competition. So some examples could include the use of chemicals or the use of any explosives. Those would definitely not be counted at all, especially the explosives. Another thing to point out is that actions must be dependent, sequential, and use a different category of simple machine from the previous action. More on this in just a bit. And one last thing I wanted to point out is that the categories of simple machines are the same between middle school and high school competitions. Here is a pictorial representation of all the various different types of machine categories, just to give students a heads up and a general idea of what these machines are and what they could be and how they could be used in the competition. And now, going back to that previous statement of actions must be dependent, sequential, and use a different category simple machine from the previous action, what this means is that in order for all actions to count, the previous action must be different from the action that proceeds after it, and etc., etc. So an example would be if a student were to start off with an inclined plane, the student needs to use any of the other different types of categories of machines in order for the next action to count. So as long as the student doesn't use an inclined plane followed by an inclined plane, the actions will count. Another interesting point is that machines must use at least 2 different categories of machines in order for all the machines to potentially count for the competition. Now, I understand this can be a little confusing, so let's go over this example here. On the top, we have 4 different types of Mason machines, labeled 1, 2, 3, 4. And on the left, we have all of the actions that it has going from the first action all the way to the 6th action. For machine 1, the student only uses 6 inclined planes for the Mason machine. In the second example, for machine 2, the student alternates between an inclined plane and a pulley all the way until it reaches 6 actions. For the third student, the student uses an inclined plane, followed by a pulley, followed by an inclined plane, followed by wheel and axle, followed by inclined plane, and then finally with electronics. And for Mason machine 4, the student uses an inclined plane, followed by a pulley, followed by 2 inclined planes, followed by 2 electronics. Now, in order to make this a little bit easier, I've done some highlighting to kind of explain and point out some of the nuances of how actions will be counted. So in the first example, because every action is essentially the same as the previous action, the student will only have one action actually count in the competition. In the second example, because the actions are alternating from one category of machine to the next, this student will have a total of 6 actions that count for the student's project. For the third Mason machine, because it continues the process of alternating between one different thing to another, when going from one action to the next, there will also be 6 actions that count for the student. And lastly, for student number 4, the first 2 actions, inclined plane followed by pulley, will count as 2 actions. For the third and fourth action, because they're exactly the same, going from one to the next, third and fourth action will unfortunately only count as 1 action. And then going to the fifth and sixth actions because they're exactly the same going from one to the next, 5th and 6th action will also unfortunately only count as one action. So machine number 4 has one action from the plane, one action from the pulley. These two planes count as one action. These two electronics count as one action, for a total of 4 actions for machine number 4. Based off this information, machine number 1 and machine number 4 do not have the required number of minimum actions for either middle school or high school, and therefore would get disqualified, whereas machine 2 and machine 3 meet the minimum requirement number of actions for middle school and high school, because the minimum for middle school is 5 and the minimum for high school is 6.